This 40-minute video is to explain the process and what happened when I was given an unexpected challenge to resolve a mystery within a village. The story starts in May 2015 when my wife and I moved to a farm just a mile outside this village. The village is Dunning, located about 8 miles to the west of Perth in Scotland. And what the mystery revolved was around a street sign. A month after we moved into the village, we were in then one of the 3 places where you could eat and buy food in the village. And we got talking to 3 people on an adjoining table who happened to be members of the Dunning Historical Society. I mentioned I was interested in history, so they gave me the challenge. And the challenge was to find out the meaning of the word Granco. Little was I to know when I took up this challenge that it would take a huge amount of my time. So I accepted the challenge, but said as I've just moved house into a new build, there was quite a bit of activity to do, especially with the wilderness called the garden, before I could start this. So the campaign to resolve this problem, what and who if was Granco, started in 2016. Before I go on and talk about this, here's an aerial shot of most of the village. I could get later shots, but the angle was wrong to show the street. The actual street is highlighted here. The village actually goes down here a few streets down to the bottom of the picture. And the way the picture is, you're looking west with north to the right. This is St Serph's Church, built in 1144. And there's quite a few roads into Dunning, but this one here is Upper Granco Street, and this one here is Lower Granco Street. I was later to find out that there was a castle here that nobody in the village knew about, called Castle Granco. So the path goes to the castle. As an aside, the village has a long history going back well over 1,000 years, and its name is an Irish name, Dunann. Dun is a castle, Ann is small, and just on a small mound beside the village there's a small fort, hence the name of the village. Dunann means small fort. Before I get into talking about Granco specifically, what the people in the village said to me was they tried to find a meaning within the different languages of Scotland's history and couldn't, but they had checked the internet and couldn't find any living person's name Granco. The trouble was that mentally in my head shut down the people search, so I started to look at language. Before I tell you about Granco and language, you have to understand a little bit about the language history of Scotland. In fact, United Kingdom as it now is. So language. Starting prior to the birth of Christ, 700 years before, to the time, the Roman Empire, when it existed, called the southern part of what is now the United Kingdom, England and Wales, Britannia. So the linguistic professors and academics called this linguistic group you see here highlighted as the Brittonic language. Note that Ireland, although part of the British Isles, nowadays actually is a different language group, actually linked to Portuguese. Jumping forward to 650, lots of different things happened. From about the year 200, a tribe from Ireland here, called the Scoti, started to emigrate first along the coast into this area here, and they eventually created an empire they called Dalradia. The Romans left Britannia. They never really conquered Scotland. They tried 3 times and for various reasons didn't proceed, but they did take over this area here, and they were there for just under 400 years, but they left in 410 without an army behind or without anything to defend. At that time and before the Romans left, the Pictish peoples, the tribe that lived here, was going down the coast raiding. And likewise the Scoti here were coming down the coast raiding. So the people in Londinium, the capital of what was Rome down here, asked two tribes from the Rhine Valley in what is now Germany and northern Germany to help them keep the pesky Picts and Scoti at bay. These were the Saxons and the Angles from Germany, and later from Denmark and southern thing came the Jutes. You can see here the name of Scotland, and you can see here the name of England starting to arrive. But by the time you get to 650, just by natural migration, because this was the better land than we came from, these peoples moved more and more across. As the Angles moved along the south coast, the people that lived here moved to further regions and up here. But they moved across to France, to the peninsula called Brittany, Britannia, and they spoke a language called Breton, and people there still speak Breton, the precursor of the Brittonic language that the whole of these islands here spoke up to that time, although with different accents and with slightly different words due to geography. To try and stop the spread of these peoples, the Scots and Dalradia and the Picts built a wall called the Catrail from what was roughly the Scottish-English border nowadays, 60 kilometres north. It didn't really work because they didn't have the money or the people to defend it. King Offa of Wales did the same here. They had a bit more success, and they built that around the year 600. But we now know that this part here at the top was built by the Romans 200 years before. The peoples here in their annals in now Wales they talk about the lost lands, and the lost lands was culture and language. These peoples came with different language. These came with a similar language, but there were slight differences. This all affects when you're looking for language, where the root of language. This is the best scientists came up with of the situation around 600. The pink areas here show the immigration from the east. So this is Wales, and you can see, but this doesn't imply that all the Brittonic speaking people disappeared. They were still there. People just get assimilated. And the Scoti here had the Empire Dalratia, but it eventually became really big. An interesting thing about the Britons, as I told you earlier, that went to France, they also went north they had a castle here called Donad, which is the big rock at a place called Dunbarton, and they had an empire called Alt Clwt. Alt means stream, Clwt is the name of the Clyde River. So they had an empire which eventually covered down here called An Clwt. And that actually they actually spoke the early Breton languages. These areas here were the Picts. They also spoke a Britannic language, but they were different. These maps were never accurate because nobody actually knows where the boundaries are. It's just a rough idea. It's the best they could. The 6 Pictish kingdoms, they never had a written language that we know of and have found, but we know some of their words. By the time you get to 1100, roughly, and I mean roughly, this was the split of languages in these islands. Welsh was still a variation of Brittonic, but it was changing as time goes on. There was still a Brittonic language here, Cornish, which a few people can speak today. The tribes from Germany and Denmark and so on were assimilating across here, but there were still people speaking different Brittonic languages and dialects at that time. In Scotland around 1100, it's thought that this was the Scots-speaking main area, Scots Gaelic, and Norn was the variation of a mix between Scots Gaelic and the Viking languages, the Norse languages, and it was called Norn, and people could speak that until around 1850 in these areas. But don't think that it's black and white with these lines. For instance, by the time you get to 1200, the Scots language had started to move up here and Gaelic was declining. Having said that, in the 1700s here, there was people speaking Irish and Scottish Gaelic, and also here. And there was people here in the late 1600s and early 1700s speaking the Alt Clut Britain language. So it's a mix. It's just a rough guide. Languages get assimilated. Time moves on. So here's some examples of language, and I'm using names and places near where Dunning is, but it's truly applicable for anywhere within Scotland. You can see here that Aber is an Irish word for when two rivers join, or the river joins the sea, or the river joins a lake or a loch. So you can see examples of Ruthven in Aberdeen, but Ruthven here is a village not far from Dunning, but Ruthven is a Norse word, so it's a Viking word, and it means a castle on the hill. And the river the Vikings would sail up to get to Aberruthven was called the Erin, but in actual fact it was Erin, and it means Irish water. And the Old Welsh spelling for the word Aber was Apur. You can see, depending on the search for a language, it depends where you go. Scottish Gaelic is 25% different from Irish Gaelic, but the word Inver is the same as Aber. There's only 21 letters in Gaelic, so PH at the middle of a word means V. Here's another example, Abernethy. So we have the Aber again because of the confluence of the rivers. But Nethy is something different. Nethy means gleaming, and that language goes back to around the year 500 to 800 AD, spoken by the Brittonic people in southern England at the time, what is now England. And the original name for Abernethy was Apur, the ancient word for Aber. So Aberthingy. In the southern uplands of Scotland, in a valley called Yarrow, there's a farm called Altreeve, which is an English variation of the Welsh word Eltrev, which means old farmstead. It's interesting that this farmstead in this valley had people living in the late 1600s and early 1700s that spoke the original Anclut Brittonic language. Tindrum, which is on the road up to the west side of Scotland, has a Gaelic name, Tana Droma, which simply means the farm on the ridge. Glasgow began as a monastery in around 500. The monks used the Latin name Familia, but the Anclut Britons called it Glasgow, which means dear family, and that's the name of the town today. Drum or Droma is a Scots Gaelic word for ridge. It's been anglified and changed in various maps and things to Drum and Drummy. So if you drive from the town of Perth to Dunning, you'll see Drumside and Drum of Garvock. There's a house called Inverdunning House. If you went to the people in the village in the early start of the last century, and the older people in the village currently remember this, they called it Drummy Fug, because it's on a slight ridge sticking out with the glaciers and the volcanoes stopped, and it was always smoky, because Fug is an ancient Scots word prior to 1700, and it means smelly and smoky. There's a place called Findogask. This is a name based on a person's name. There was an Irish monk, an early Christian, who came and lived there. So it's named after his name, Fionga, and it's on a piece of land sticking out. So that's an English word, gask, being a geological feature. So you can start to see the mixture. There's even a village nearby 2 miles away called Aberdalgie, and that's a real mix. Aber for the mixture of two waters. Dal is a Scots Gaelic word for a field, and Gee is a slang Scots word for a thorn. And then, of course, there's the Scots language, which I mentioned. The Scots language is developed, like English and any other language, from the peoples that are there and the peoples that infiltrate it and migrate into it. The Scots word bairn means baby. In Norway, it's barn, pronounced the same. In fact, in Norway, a kindergarten is called a barnhus. And hus is a Scots word for house, from the Norwegian word hus. Hos is the German word for house, and that's where the English word comes from. They're not the same root. One is Norwegian and Swedish, one is German. Bra means good in Scots, as it does today in Sweden. Thrapple is the Scots word for throat, and it goes back to about the year 500 or 600 for the Old English Brittonic word for windpipe, which was thropple. Polis in Scots means police. It's been used since before the 1700s, and it's named after the Swedish word polis. So in Sweden the police are called polis now. In Scotland people think it's just a slang word, but it goes back 200 or 300 years. Police cars in Scotland have the Gaelic pronunciation of polis, but it's the Gaelic copies the Scots, it's not the other way around. Coming back now to the search for Granco. From the previous search and knowledge of languages, I knew that I had to look into these different dictionaries. If you go back far enough, all written text was in Latin, not current Latin, Old Latin, and Old Scots. Scots was used in everything in this country, all legal documents, all everything, up until about 1910, when there was a major effort by the UK state to remove the Scots language and only teach English. The search actually took me 110 days to do the bit on words within these different dictionaries. That's not 110 days, all days. That's 100 days of doing something over a whole year. But here's some, I was looking for here in this example, Gran, to see the part of Granco. And you can see how Gran, there's your Irish, and the old Gran comes back, and here it's spelled that it's also Irish, but it's Welsh, it's Cornish, it's Breton. And the word for ugly is an early language, and the word grain means a bristly hairy cloth. And you can see, if you spent the time looking at this, it comes from different parts of the world. So it's difficult to see how Granco fits into this. The closest words I could get to put together for Granco at the end of my extensive language set, was the word grancy, which means a granary. And the last recorded written use of the word grancy was in 1907. In Gaelic, Scots Gaelic, the word co, pronounced with the K sound, means earn, to earn money, to earn wealth, to earn food, to earn something. Grank is an old Scots word meaning to moan, once again pre-1700s. The emphasis here is this is when the merger of the political union between Scotland and England happened. But none of these things, as you can see, look anything like Granco. So the biggest part of my search ended when I concluded that the word street name Granco had nothing to do with language. So I thought, what gives things names? So geology can name things. There's features in the landscape, be it a river, a canyon, a spur of rock, can give a name to a location based on that. But I personally know a lot about geology, and the actual landscape of Scotland. It's a large book, by an author called Con Gillen, and looking at maps from the Geological Society of the rock features in this area, and just with my own eyes what I could see, there was nothing related to geology. Geography, local topographic features can give things name, but where Dunning is at the side of the Oakhill Hills, there's no hill feature that stands out, and there's no real graphic feature or height or soil or anything that actually says it's geography. I did spend time on this one. So I decided to look at maps and see if I could find the cause. Maps in the past were very poor. This map of Scotland in 1668, Dunning's about here. You can see that this, if you know the country in the map at all, it's distorted, roughly the correct shape, but hugely distorted. Coming forward in time, 1778, the shape and sizing is becoming more and more right. Dunning is here. And you can see that this is a copy of a large document because you can see the writing around the edge of the country where villages and towns are. But still, this is no good to find anything about Granco. Before I go on, a few words about map history in Scotland. In fact, the world. Between 1707 and 1745, there was 4 rebellions in Scotland against the Union with England. But this one was actually different. The 1745 one, which started in 44, was actually a royalty thing. It was somebody who wanted to be and thought they had history to the UK crown and wanted to use the loyalty of Scotland to try and take over, and it was a disaster. So after this thing, the military who was controlling Scotland by now, incidentally they built nearly 600 fortifications across Scotland, 430 with stone, and they managed Scotland this way until 1810. But they didn't know their way around, for the maps were useless. So in 1747 they asked a young man, 21-year-old, to map the Highlands, and he did in 8 years. These were used by famous generals in Scottish history like General Wade and so on to put roads and bridges in to control the military occupation. It was so successful that the UK government, as it then became, in 1791 created a map division called Ordnance Survey. And it was people using these skills that went to America and mapped the Mason-Dixon line, for instance. So here we have a map of Dunning in 1859. This is Granco Street here, upper, lower. It's simply because it's on the hill going downhill. And here, where there is now houses and no records at all, is a castle. There's no folk memory in the village about this. And this word Granco here shows the lands of Granco, which I'll explain more in a minute. In fact, the lands of Granco covered most of the area to the north of the village, this being north. So here's it again. There's Granco Street. But now the castle is called Castle Grange, and that's just the same. But the maps have improved. Following on from the castle, I realised that Granco came before Castle. So what I did, I looked in various documents through history. My first search area was the minutes in Scots of the Scottish Parliament from around 1100 through until when it closed down in 1707. And all those documents can be translated into English. So this is a document from July 1681, and it's for a person called Rollo, which was an English lord that has land nowadays and still does in Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. And he bought very good agricultural land on the north side of Dunning. And you can see here that in the Kirkton means Church of Dunning, in the borough of Dunning. he got all the land, the houses and everything, that are called Granco, otherwise called the Chapel Lands of Dunning. So this is definite proof. I found other references to the Chapel Lands of Dunning, as well as I looked at different documents. I have this record in 1566 in with the 7-volume Great Seal of Scotland. When King Robert the Bruce became King of Scotland, he wanted all land transactions to be legally recorded, and they were for many years. You can see how long they were here. And in this book and others, I found many references here to somebody here called Donald O'Kelty, who actually bought land in Granco, alias the Chapel Landis of Donning. In this document I found 13 different spellings of Dunning. But you can see now I have proof that this Granco, the street, and Granco, the name, and the church were tied to this time in the past. I then started to look at the church side. Dunning Church was built in 1144. Near Crieff, a village north of Dunning, there was an abbey called Inchcaffrey, built around the same time. But there was another one in Fife, the area south of us, on the River Forth estuary, called Couros. And the Abbey of Couros managed the Church of St Sephren in Dunning, despite the fact the other one's nearer. I could find all the written records from Inchcaffrey going back to 1522, talking about the lands of Dunning and Granco, especially Dunning going back well before the year 1100. So here I am now thinking, well, that's it. So I tried to find the records from the Couros Abbey, thinking they'd give me more information about St Sephren and Granco. Unfortunately, when Cromwell came to Scotland and destroyed both those abbeys and burnt them down, the monks at Couros didn't get the records out in time, and if they did, they've been lost to antiquity, so I couldn't find those records. But the other, north of here, all the records in Old Latin are still there and can be searched online. So where was I at this point? I know the name wasn't in a root language going to our past. I knew it was before the 1520s and 30s. It wasn't a geological term and it wasn't a geographical term. There was a castle there, but that didn't help because it was named after Granco. So Granco obviously existed before the castle, because the castle's named after the name. And I know that the Chapel Lands 1566 was there in a written text, but I also found the Latin records going back to the 1520s from the church. Not having any luck, I began to wonder if it was a family name. This type of search put me off because the village were adamant that they had searched the internet and could find no names Granco. So I believed them. That was mistake number one. I wish I'd done it first. So I started to look at St Serph's if I could find a name. As I say, the church of St Serph's goes back a long time. So I looked at the records, the land records from 1306 to 1566, found nothing. So these records are all to do with landowners. So the fact that Granco wasn't in there told me he wasn't a landowner. And I wondered if he had records in the local birth. And there's several ancestry sites in different countries. So I looked at some ancestry sites for here. So this website here is very good for looking at records. But I could get records from St Serph's from 1533. It didn't include these dates here due to damage, flooding, war, various disputes. But basically, I knew from looking at this and from the date 1533 and from the searches earlier that the name Granco came before this time. Because I've seen records that the Chapel Lands of Granco existed. So I started a search, and I did a search in America. And you can see here in the census of 1881 Missouri, there was somebody called S.B. Granco. Iowa, 1836, Mary Granco, Kansas. And you come down to here, and this is Puerto Rico. And interestingly, these two names are different, but they're man and wife. This gave me a clue to the origin of the name. And here you can see that the name Granco follows the Western method of the husband and the wife having the same surname, where here you can see they are married but they don't have the same name. This became important later in my search. One day while looking at something on Amazon, I did a search for the name Granco and found this Portuguese author, Divaldo Pereira Granco, who writes books in Portuguese. So I knew it was a name, but could I link it back to Dunning? I could also find here in the Wikipedia, I searched Wikipedia for the name Granco, and I found Luciano, who was an ace fighting against the fascists in the Spanish Civil War prior to 1940. Eventually I found a website. I don't know how accurate it is because every country does recording of population in different languages and in different databases. But this website purports to say you can put a surname in and it'll tell you around the world where it is. So this is how many I could find here. 2 in the UK, and you can see that the prevalence here is Brazil. So, but as the Brazilians all speak Portuguese, unscientifically I concluded that the name used to be from Portugal. But I also know from my search that some people in Spain and some people in Italy, very similar language, also were called Granco. I could also find names of businesses that use these names. One here on the left in America, and the one on the right is actually in Ireland, Northern Ireland, in Ulster. And here's another from Hong Kong. As you can see, the names in many places, although it's rare. Hong Kong. So the origin of Granco, and why is it so rare? Because it's Portuguese and to a lesser extent other areas, their names, unlike the West, like the UK, don't use, the wife doesn't take the husband's name and so on. The maternal names precede the paternal ones, but the opposite in these countries is always possible. So a child can receive a surname from his or her parents' ancestors, even if the surnames are not part of their parents' names. That's what you were seeing earlier in the American census. So, to explain how language works, Portuguese family names are made up usually of 2 words and are not hyphenated. They're not composite names, they are single names. So here's an example. Some names are toponyms, so it's a castle, Granco. It could be religious, the Saint Spirit or Saint Rita. There could be expressions like that's a family, and that means 1,000 people. So names can be made up with these things. But in the case of words, Camellia Castello Granco could never be called Camilo Granco. He would only ever be called Camellia Castel Granco. And it's this merging here that makes it difficult to follow family trees and track things back, especially to the 1400s, where I was convinced that Granco came from. Because there's documents proving that the lands of Granco and the church were north of Dunning and they were actually linked to the church, early 1500s, the name must have originated in the 1400s at the very least. I also found other spellings around the world of Granco. So, to sum up my findings, I couldn't find proof of Granco in any dictionary after a huge effort. There is a castle called Granco, but the castle name's based on Granco, so that was after Granco. I could find that Granco was used as an alias for the chapel lands of Dunning, which caused a huge search through religious records. I made the assumption eventually that it was a family name, so I checked the birth records relating to Granco for St Serph's Church and in fact the area round about, and found nothing. I could find proof that Granco is and has been a family name, and I knew that the family name was at least used locally in the 1400s and somehow linked to the chapel lands. I know it's rare, and it's still used today. I believe it's Portuguese. So, my conclusion was that Granco was a Portuguese name. And I know he was there in the 1400s because records in 1566 and indeed earlier show that the lands and everything in legal documents related to the name Granco. If he was foreign, this is where I assume things, he would have stood out in the area. He must have been good to what he did for his name to stick for centuries and be in all these legal documents. So what was a potential Portuguese man doing here in Dunning in the 1400s? The answer is this. Portugal had a huge empire in the 1400s and the early 1500s, and their soldiers were held in prowess, and they had mercenaries everywhere, and the very strong Roman Catholic Church at the time used trained soldiers after they retired to actually stand as guards. And I believe what happened is the Roman Catholic Church of Couros brought somebody from Portugal to make sure that their lands were administered properly and that there was no skullduggery or problems. So my conclusion in my search, not based on concrete proof like birth records of someone called Granco that lived here, but just written documentation that proved he did. He was a conquistador, and this is how he would have been dressed if he was in his military outfit and his findings. So there, ladies and gentlemen, is the conclusion of my story. The name Granco was a Portuguese person. He looked after the church lands for the church and the lands north of Dunning. Many wealthy people over the centuries gave land to the churches, no doubt hedging their bets for the afterlife. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you. I hope you find the search through it interesting. Before I go, just for interest, a couple of photographs of Dunning. I showed you a document earlier where Lord Rollo from England bought some lands in Dunning, and he bought a lot of land in some of the chapel lands. And in what is now Rollo Park and a 9-hole golf course, he built Duncrab House, which had over 300 rooms, which was demolished in the 1950s, so the family didn't have to pay death duties. The station here was demolished in the 1960s due to rationalisation of railways. This is the main square in Dunning as it was in the 1800s. This is the Church of St Sephirin. The tower here was built in 1144. The nave and everything you see here was actually rebuilt in the 1860s. But you can see the marks on the wall of the tower where the old roofline used to be. And the Tron Square in the village, this is a very old picture as well. Now there's a third tree there. It was to commemorate the burning down of every house in the village apart from one in 1716, caused by a fleeing army. Thanks very much. I hope you find my struggle through the history interesting. Bye.